Picture this situation. It is 8 o'clock at night. You are standing in your kitchen after an entirely chaotic day.
That sounds incredibly familiar.
Right, and you realize you have barely eaten anything of substance since breakfast. So you find yourself staring at that massive plastic tub of protein powder sitting right on top of the fridge.
The one that takes up way too much space.
Exactly. You pull it down, you scoop the powder into a shaker, add some water, and as you shake it, you cannot help but wonder if you are drinking some kind of magical muscle elixir or, just heavily processed milk dust. Welcome to TalkKast. That tub of protein powder has become weirdly emotional for a lot of people. I mean, you have the fitness crowd treating it like an absolute lifestyle requirement.
Right, like a magic powder where you drink it, your arms inflate, and your life becomes a highlight reel.
That is exactly it. And on the exact opposite side, you have the wellness crowd looking at that same tub and viewing it as, synthetic junk. Something entirely unnatural that only exists because marketing departments need another product to sell.
That tension is so real, and honestly, that confusion makes complete sense when you look at where this product actually lives.
Tell me more about that.
Well, it sits directly at the very messy intersection of food, fitness, and modern marketing. Those three worlds have completely different goals, and they really do not always play nicely together.
That makes total sense.
When you mix the aesthetic promises of the fitness industry with the purity obsession of the wellness industry, you end up with a product that is fundamentally misunderstood by almost everyone who buys it.
That is exactly why we need to talk about this. Because if we step away from the marketing hype, the polarizing opinions, and the gym stereotypes, we can actually make sense of what this powder is doing.
I agree completely.
The goal is to remove the emotion entirely. Because when we do that, this confusing, mystical supplement turns into a surprisingly simple, rather boring, but incredibly useful tool.
That is a great way to frame it.
But before we can understand the powder in the tub, we first have to understand what the body actually does with protein itself, completely separate from gym culture.
Right, we have to establish the biological baseline.
Exactly. We need to move away from this pervasive stereotype that protein is only for building biceps.
That is the perfect place to start. To understand protein, we have to look at it on a molecular level. At its core, protein is simply a macronutrient, just like carbohydrates and fats.
I get what you mean. It is one of the big three.
Exactly. But unlike carbs and fats, which your body primarily uses for energy, protein is structural. It is built from amino acids, which act like tiny, highly specific building blocks.
So they are the physical materials of the body.
Right. They are linked together in these long, complex chains by nitrogen bonds. When you eat a piece of chicken, a bowl of lentils, or, a scoop of powder, your body does not just absorb whole protein.
What does it do instead?
It relies on enzymes in your stomach and small intestine to painstakingly break those long chains down into individual amino acids.
That is fascinating.
Once they are broken down, your body absorbs them into the bloodstream and then essentially rearranges them into whatever specific new proteins it needs to build at that exact millisecond.
I really like that building block analogy. It is like taking a fully built Lego castle, smashing it into individual bricks, and then using those same bricks to build a spaceship, a car, or a bridge, depending on what you need right now.
That is precisely how it works. And the things your body chooses to build are incredibly diverse. Muscle is just one tiny fraction of the whole picture.
What else is it building?
For instance, protein is actively used to build and maintain your entire immune system. The antibodies that fight off viruses are literally made of proteins.
Wait, really? I hadn't thought of it that way.
It is true. It produces the enzymes that allow your body to digest food, replicate DNA, and perform basic cellular functions. It produces hormones like insulin and serotonin that regulate your metabolism and your mood. It is the literal structural foundation for your bones, your skin, your hair, and your connective tissues.
That is a massive perspective shift. So we really should not be looking at it as a bodybuilder nutrient. It is fundamentally an alive human nutrient. It is the lumber and the nails holding the entire house together.
That is a great way to frame it. The muscle aspect only gets the spotlight because it is the most visible, aesthetic part of the story, which makes it incredibly easy to market.
That makes total sense.
You cannot put a photo of a highly optimized digestive enzyme on a billboard and sell it, but you can certainly sell a photo of a flexed bicep.
That explains a lot. But it brings up a question I hear all the time. If protein is absolutely required for general survival and basic biological function, why do we treat protein intake like a gym personality trait?
What do you mean by that?
I mean, I know so many people who say things like, well, I do not lift weights, so I do not need to worry about my protein.
That mindset is entirely a product of the marketing machine we just talked about, not human biology.
That is interesting.
If we look at broad nutrition guidelines, like the ones established by health authorities in the United Kingdom, across Europe, and the US, they are based strictly on your body weight, not your gym identity.
So what is the actual baseline then?
The baseline requirement for normal health in a generally healthy sedentary population is around 0.83 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day.
Okay, let us pause there so people can visualize that. For someone who weighs about 70 kilograms, or roughly 150 pounds, that is roughly 58 grams of protein a day.
Precisely, and it is crucial to understand what that number actually represents.
Go on.
That 0.83 grams is not a target for optimal thriving, and it certainly is not a target for building muscle. It is derived from nitrogen balance studies.
So it is just a minimum.
Exactly. It is the absolute minimum baseline requirement to keep your immune system functioning, your enzymes producing, and your tissues repairing themselves from daily normal wear and tear.
And if you do not hit it?
Without that baseline, your body starts to cannibalize its own muscle tissue to survive. It is the floor, not the ceiling.
That is a really vital distinction. So that is the baseline for a typical adult. But the idea of aging brings up a very counterintuitive truth. A lot of people assume that as you get older, your metabolism slows down, you're less active, and therefore you need less protein. But that is actually the exact opposite of reality, right?
It is, and this is an area where public health messaging has really fallen behind. Older adults actually need significantly more protein than younger adults.
That is surprising.
While a healthy 25-year-old might be perfectly fine hovering around that 0.83 gram baseline, a common evidence-informed target for adults over the age of 65 is around 1.0 to 1.2 grams per kilogram.
Why is that? What actually changes in the body to require more?
It comes down to a biological concept called anabolic resistance.
Tell me more about that.
As we age, our bodies become significantly less efficient at processing dietary protein and translating it into muscle protein synthesis. Think of it like a radio signal that is slowly getting weaker.
I see.
To get the exact same response from the muscles, an older body requires a much stronger nutritional signal, which means a higher absolute dose of protein.
And what happens if they do not get that higher dose?
If they do not hit that higher target, they face a very real risk of sarcopenia, which is age-related muscle loss, and that leads directly to frailty and a loss of independence.
I hadn't thought of it that way. So the inefficiency of an aging body demands a higher intake just to maintain the status quo.
Exactly. And then moving along the spectrum, you have resistance-trained individuals.
The gym crowd.
Right. People who lift weights are intentionally creating microscopic damage to their muscle tissues. Because they are deliberately breaking down tissue, their repair requirements are vastly elevated.
So where do their numbers sit?
Their needs typically sit much higher up, often recommended between 1.4 and 2.0 grams per kilogram, depending on their total energy intake and how brutal their training actually is.
That makes perfect sense. And just to round out the picture, where do children and teenagers fit into this?
Their needs are incredibly dynamic. Their protein requirements are tied entirely to rapid growth and neurological development.
So it changes a lot.
Yes. Their needs fluctuate wildly based on their age, their growth spurts, and their athletic participation.
That is a lot to track.
But the overarching point across all these demographics is identical. Everyone needs enough protein to survive. The only question is whether your specific life stage, age, or activity level means you need to push higher than the baseline.
That explains a lot. It completely removes the identity politics from the nutrient. Okay, so since protein is universally essential for every human being, that brings us back to the giant tub on top of the fridge.
Let us unpack that tub.
Why did whey, out of all the possible protein sources in the world, I mean, you have beef, eggs, soy, peas, why did whey become the absolute universal default for getting extra protein?
To understand that, we have to demystify what is actually inside that tub. People look at the bright neon labels and the aggressive branding, and they assume it is a synthetic invention cooked up in a laboratory by people in white coats.
That is exactly what it looks like.
But it isn't. It comes straight from a dairy farm. The process is remarkably traditional. It all starts with the cheese-making process.
Wait, really? Tell me more about that. How do we get from cheese to a powder?
When dairy farmers make cheese, they take raw milk and add enzymes, usually rennet, to cause the milk to curdle and separate.
Okay.
Milk protein is essentially composed of two types. Roughly 80% is casein and 20% is whey. When the milk curdles, the solid parts, the casing, clump together to form curds, which are then pressed and aged to become cheese.
Right, like the curds you see in cottage cheese.
Exactly. Now, the translucent, slightly yellowish liquid that separates from those solid curds is the whey.
So it is just a liquid leftover.
Yes. And historically, for hundreds of years, cheesemakers considered whey to be an annoying industrial byproduct. It was mostly water, and they had absolutely no use for it.
What did they do with it?
They would literally dump it into rivers, use it as cheap fertilizer, or feed it to pigs. It wasn't until the late 20th century, when environmental regulations stopped them from dumping it into waterways, that the dairy industry was forced to find a use for it.
That is incredible. So the foundation of the modern fitness supplement industry was basically a waste management solution for cheese farmers.
It really was. Eventually, food scientists developed the technology to take that liquid byproduct and run it through incredibly fine microfilters.
To get the protein out.
Yes, to separate the protein from the water, the fats, and the milk sugars. Once it was highly filtered, they used a process called spray drying to evaporate the remaining moisture, leaving behind a very fine, shelf-stable powder.
That actually makes total sense. I like to think about it using the analogy of grapes and raisins.
How so?
Well, a raisin is not some terrifying synthetic grape. It is just a regular grape that has had the water removed, leaving behind a much more concentrated, shelf-stable version of the original food that you can just throw in your backpack.
That is a brilliant way to frame it.
Whey powder is exactly the same concept. You are taking a natural byproduct of cheese, concentrating the protein, and putting it in a modern format.
The raisin analogy is perfect. The processing is not inherently evil. It is just a method of preservation and concentration.
Okay, but if it is just concentrated cheese water, why is it so highly prized biologically? There must be a reason athletes swear by it over other sources.
There are a few very real biological advantages to whey. First, it has a phenomenal essential amino acid profile.
Meaning it has all the building blocks.
Yes, it is a complete protein, meaning it provides all 9 essential amino acids that your body cannot manufacture on its own. But the real star of the show is an amino acid called leucine.
Why does leucine matter so much?
Whey is exceptionally high in leucine compared to almost any other food source. And leucine acts like a biological light switch inside your muscle cells.
That sounds important.
It is. Through a complex signaling pathway in the body known as mTOR, leucine is the specific amino acid trigger that tells the body to initiate muscle protein synthesis.
So it starts the building process.
Exactly. Without enough circulating leucine, the body simply will not turn on the machinery to build new muscle, regardless of how much total protein you eat. Because whey is so dense in leucine, it flips that switch very effectively.
I see. So it is not just the total amount of bricks you have, it is having the specific foreman on the construction site telling the workers to actually start building.
That is exactly right. The second biological advantage is digestion speed.
Because it is a liquid.
Well, because whey is water-soluble and no longer attached to the slow-digesting casein curds, it empties from the stomach very rapidly.
And that is a good thing.
Yes, because this leads to a massive, rapid spike of amino acids entering the bloodstream, which is exactly what you want when you are trying to rapidly elevate muscle protein synthesis.
But if I am being entirely honest, I feel like for the average person, the real magic is not the leucine or the mTOR pathway.
What is it then?
The real magic is just the logistics.
Tell me more about how you see that playing out.
Well, let us return to that incredibly relatable scenario we started with. Imagine you leave the house for work at 7:30 in the morning. Your meetings are stacked back-to-back all day.
We all know that feeling.
Lunch is a sad prepackaged sandwich eaten hurriedly at your desk while you are furiously answering emails. By the time you get home at 8 p.m., you have absolutely zero energy to chop vegetables, preheat the oven, and cook a proper balanced meal.
It is exhausting just thinking about it.
Right. Hitting a specific target of 120 grams of protein from whole foods in that scenario is incredibly difficult. And it is not because you lack nutritional knowledge or discipline. It is because your day simply does not cooperate.
That is a very grounded perspective.
In that world, a scoop of whey is just a logistical gap filler. It is portable, it sits in your desk drawer for 6 months without going bad, and it requires zero cooking.
That is true.
You mix it with water, and you instantly have 30 grams of highly bioavailable protein.
That is exactly the reality. It shifts the perspective completely. It is not a performance enhancer. It is just a highly convenient food replacement when modern life gets messy.
But that leads perfectly into a paradox. If it really is just convenient powdered food, why is the culture surrounding it so intensely stressful?
You mean the gym culture?
Yes. Why are there so many rigid rules, superstitions, and anxieties about exactly when and how you absolutely must consume it?
The short answer is that the fitness industry thrives on complexity.
That makes a lot of sense.
If the message was simply, eat enough protein by the end of the day, it would be very hard to sell specialized magazines, customized programs, and highly specific supplements. Creating a sense of urgency and highly technical rules creates a dependency on the products being sold.
Let us dismantle some of those rules right now, starting with the biggest myth of all, the idea that drinking whey automatically builds muscle.
It absolutely does not. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of human metabolism.
How so?
Muscle is an incredibly expensive tissue for the body to maintain. It requires a lot of calories just to exist. Your body is fundamentally an efficiency machine shaped by evolution. It operates on a strict use it or lose it basis.
So it is lazy, basically.
Very lazy. It will never expend the precious energy required to build or maintain extra muscle mass unless it is given a highly compelling physical reason to do so.
And that reason is resistance training.
Exactly. Lifting weights, moving heavy loads, or applying mechanical tension sends a localized mechanical signal to the body that this extra muscle is useful and absolutely necessary for survival in this environment.
So the workout is the trigger.
The workout is the architect handing over the blueprints. The protein you eat is merely the raw material required to fulfill that biological request.
That is a useful way to look at it.
You can deliver all the bricks you want to the construction site, but if there is no architect telling the workers to build, those bricks are just going to sit there. Or, in the case of protein, be oxidized for energy or excreted.
I get what you mean about the raw material, but let us talk about timing, because this is where people really lose their minds.
The anabolic window.
Exactly. What about the infamous anabolic window? I know people who absolutely panic if they do not drink a protein shake within 30 minutes of leaving the gym.
It is a very common fear.
I have literally seen people aggressively shaking their bottles in the locker room, terrified that if they wait until they get home, the entire workout goes to waste.
That 30-minute panic is an entirely overstated myth, and it causes so much unnecessary psychological stress.
Where did that idea even come from?
The concept of the very narrow anabolic window originated from early sports science research. Some early studies showed that consuming protein immediately after a fasted workout spiked synthesis rates.
Okay, so there is some science there.
Yes, but the supplement marketing machine took that very specific context and blew it vastly out of proportion for the general public.
So what does modern nutritional science actually say about the window?
Modern research provides a much clearer, much more forgiving understanding. The total daily intake of protein is the dominant factor by a massive margin.
So the window does not close.
The window of opportunity for muscle protein synthesis does not slam shut after 30 minutes. It is actually quite broad. After a solid resistance training session, your muscles are sensitized to protein for many hours, sometimes up to 24 or even 48 hours after the workout.
That is incredibly reassuring for anyone who has rushed home in a panic trying to beat the clock. So the exact minute you consume it really does not matter.
Exactly. Whether you drink a shake in the locker room 10 minutes after your workout, or you take a shower, drive home, and eat a normal dinner of chicken and rice 90 minutes later, the difference in muscle growth for a standard person is completely negligible.
That is good to hear.
Unless you are an elite, high-performance athlete doing multiple grueling training sessions in a single day where rapid glycogen replenishment is critical, the precise timing of your protein shake is a total distraction.
So what should people focus on instead?
The overarching goal is simply to ensure your body has an adequate supply of amino acids spread out across the entire day.
That makes so much sense. Okay, here's another rule you hear constantly, especially from old-school bodybuilders.
Which one?
The rule is that you must consume carbohydrates along with your protein shake to activate the protein. The logic I have heard is that carbs spike your insulin, and insulin acts as a key to unlock the muscle cells so the protein can get inside. Is there any truth to that mechanism?
That is another pervasive superstition that stems from a partial understanding of endocrinology. It is true that insulin is an anabolic hormone, meaning it helps build things up and prevents breakdown. But you absolutely do not need to eat carbohydrates with whey to activate the protein.
Why not? Does not the protein need the insulin spike from the carbs?
Here's the fascinating part that most people miss. Eating protein itself naturally stimulates an insulin response. Whey protein is actually highly insulinogenic on its own. When you drink a whey shake, your insulin rises naturally. That rise is more than sufficient to halt muscle protein breakdown and allow the amino acids to do their job.
I had no idea.
Research in post-exercise recovery has consistently shown that adding carbohydrates to a sufficient dose of protein, usually around 25 to 30 grams, does not significantly increase muscle protein synthesis beyond what the protein accomplishes completely by itself.
That clears up a major misconception. So adding a banana or some oats to a shake might taste fantastic, and it might give you great energy, but it is not a biological requirement for the protein to function.
Exactly. Carbohydrates are fantastic for energy, for fueling hard workouts, and for replenishing your glycogen stores after you have depleted them.
So they are not bad, just not necessary for the protein.
Right. If you like blending a banana into your shake because it tastes good, helps your performance, and fits your calorie goals, that is wonderful. But they are not a magical biochemical key required to unlock the benefits of whey. We really have to stop turning basic human food digestion into a complex, stressful superstition.
I completely agree. So since the timing panic and the carbohydrate rules are mostly distractions, that naturally brings us to the actual practical challenge.
Which is buying the right product.
So let us say someone listening decides they want to use this convenient tool. How do they navigate actually buying the right tub? Because if you walk down the supplement aisle at a nutrition store, it is completely overwhelming.
It is a visual assault.
The tubs are covered in holographic text, proprietary blends, and aggressive buzzwords. It is very easy to feel manipulated.
Navigating the supplement aisle definitely requires a bit of basic label literacy, so you can shop like an informed adult and avoid being scammed. When you strip away the marketing, there are essentially 3 types of whey you will encounter on the shelves.
Let us break those down. What is the first one?
The first and most common is whey protein concentrate. This is the least filtered, most whole version of the powder.
What does that mean practically?
Because it undergoes less intensive filtration, it retains a bit more of the natural milk fats and lactose, which is the naturally occurring milk sugar. The protein percentage in a concentrate can vary quite a bit depending on the specific manufacturing process, usually ranging anywhere from 70% to 80% protein by weight.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second type?
The second type is whey protein isolate. Isolate takes that base concentrate and puts it through additional rigorous filtration steps, often using techniques like cross-flow microfiltration.
So it's cleaner.
Yes, this extra processing strips away almost all of the remaining carbohydrates, fats, and lactose. What you are left with is a product that is highly concentrated, usually 90% or more pure protein by weight.
And there's a third one, right? The really expensive one.
Yes. The third type is whey protein hydrolysate. This is whey that has been treated with enzymes or acids to partially break down the long protein chains into smaller, shorter peptides.
So it is essentially pre-digested.
Exactly. Because the breakdown process has already been started in the lab, it absorbs slightly faster in the human gut. It is usually the most expensive option on the shelf.
These are worth the money.
Honestly, for the vast majority of casual users, the real-world biological advantage of that rapid absorption is microscopic compared to standard isolate or concentrate.
I like to use an analogy here to keep them straight. Concentrate is like eating the whole fruit. Isolate is like drinking the pure juice. And hydrolysate is like having someone chew the fruit for you before you eat it.
That is a highly descriptive, if slightly unappetizing way to remember it.
It paints a picture.
Mm-hmm.
But let us talk about the isolate for a second, because that brings up a really important point. A lot of people hear the word processing, and they automatically assume negative intent.
That happens all the time.
The wellness industry has trained us to believe that highly processed always means full of added sugars, chemicals, and junk. People assume that because isolate is more processed than concentrate, it must be worse for you. But you were saying the exact opposite is true here.
That is the key point, and it is a huge area of confusion. In the context of whey protein, the extra processing to create an isolate is actually a process of subtraction, not addition.
That is a great distinction.
The microfiltration physically removes the natural milk sugars and fats. So if someone tells you that whey isolate is bad because it is highly processed and therefore must be sugary, they have the facts completely backwards.
That is a brilliant clarification. So isolate is actually the cleaner, lower sugar option.
Exactly. It is particularly useful for people who are sensitive to lactose because the milk sugar is virtually gone. It is also preferred by athletes who are tracking their macronutrients very strictly, down to the gram, and want pure protein without any incidental fats or carbohydrates throwing off their meal plans.
So beyond knowing the difference between concentrate, isolate, and hydrolysate, how should someone actually read the back of the label to know if they are getting a good, honest product? Because I know these companies use a lot of tricks.
The single most important rule is that you have to ignore the front of the tub entirely. The front of the tub is pure marketing psychology designed to grab your attention.
Right. So where do we look?
You must turn the tub around and look at the actual math on the black and white nutrition panel. The crucial rule of thumb is to look at the scoop weight versus the protein yield.
Explain how that math works.
A serving size, which is usually 1 scoop, is not a standard universal unit of measurement. The manufacturer alone decides how big the plastic scoop inside the tub is.
That is sneaky.
It is. You need to look at the total grams per serving,
Mm-hmm.
and then look immediately below that to see how many grams of actual protein are in that serving.
Right. So a giant oversized scoop does not necessarily mean you are buying a better, more powerful product.
Exactly. Here's how you test it. If a product has a 35-gram scoop, and the label says it provides 25 grams of protein, that is a solid, honest ratio.
What about the rest of the grams?
It means roughly 70 to 80% of what you are scooping is actual protein tissue. The remaining few grams are just flavoring, cocoa powder, and natural moisture. But if you look at a label and see a massive 40-gram scoop that only yields 18 grams of protein, you have to stop and ask yourself, what exactly are the other 22 grams of powder in that scoop?
That is a fantastic way to frame it. If it is not protein, what is it? You are essentially paying premium protein prices for a massive amount of non-protein filler.
Precisely. You are paying high prices for cheap fillers, heavy flavoring agents, thickening gums, and cheap carbohydrate powders like maltodextrin.
That is probably why people gain weight unexpectedly.
Right. That non-protein material might not be inherently dangerous to your health. It might just be cheap sugar. But you need to know what you are spending your money on. You want to buy protein, not an overpriced, artificially flavored carbohydrate matrix.
And I imagine you also want to look at the calorie count to ensure you aren't accidentally drinking a 400-calorie dessert when you thought you were just getting a lean post-workout supplement.
That happens all the time. People buy a mass gainer thinking it is regular protein, and they wonder why they are gaining unwanted weight. You have to read the numbers. There is another trick to watch out for called amino spiking, or nitrogen spiking.
I have heard of that. What exactly is amino spiking?
Protein content is legally tested by measuring the total nitrogen in the powder. Unscrupulous companies will sometimes add very cheap, non-muscle building amino acids like taurine or glycine into the powder.
Why do they do that?
These cheap aminos spike the nitrogen reading, making the product look like it has 25 grams of high-quality complete protein, when in reality it only has 15 grams of real whey and 10 grams of cheap filler aminos.
That is incredibly deceptive. How do you spot that?
You look at the ingredient list. If you see individual amino acids like L-taurine, L-glycine, or glutamine listed as standalone ingredients before or right after the whey protein, it is a red flag that the product might be spiked.
That's good to know.
A good pure whey protein does not need extra individual aminos added to it. The natural profile is already perfect.
That explains a lot. And understanding those non-protein fillers and added ingredients naturally leads us into some of the more uncomfortable realities of these powders.
The digestive issues.
Exactly. A lot of people try protein shakes and find that they feel absolutely terrible afterward. They experience severe bloating, painful gas, or stomach cramps. What is actually happening biologically when that occurs?
When someone feels awful after drinking a shake, they almost always blame the whey itself. They assume their body just rejects protein powders. But very often, the protein is entirely innocent.
So what is causing the pain?
The digestive discomfort is actually caused by the artificial sweeteners, the added sugars, or the thickening gums used in those non-protein fillers we just discussed. This is where the category of protein powder splits into two very different physical experiences based purely on the ingredient list.
Tell me more about those specific ingredients. What should people be looking out for that might be wrecking their stomachs?
Let us start with the sweeteners. Broadly speaking, standard artificial sweeteners like sucralose or aspartame have been heavily studied and judged acceptable by safety authorities within established daily limits.
Right.
However, to appeal to the natural or low-calorie crowd, Manufacturers often use sugar alcohols, which are scientifically known as polyols. You will see these listed on the back of the tub as xylitol, sorbitol, maltitol, or erythritol.
Why do companies use them if they cause problems?
They use them because they provide a very pleasant sweetness without adding significant calories, and they do not spike blood sugar the way standard sucrose does.
But there is a catch.
Yes. Polyols have a very specific, inescapable physiological effect in the human digestive tract. They are not fully absorbed into the bloodstream. Instead, they pass into the large intestine where they do two things.
What are those?
First, they draw water into the intestine through a process called osmosis. Second, they are rapidly fermented by your gut bacteria.
Drawing excess water into the gut and fermenting bacteria, that sounds like a catastrophic recipe for digestive distress.
It absolutely is. In many people, especially those with sensitive digestion or conditions like irritable bowel syndrome, this osmotic effect and rapid fermentation cause severe bloating, incredibly painful gas, and strong laxative effects.
That is awful.
In fact, in certain strict regulatory environments like Europe, food products that contain a high concentration of polyols are legally required to carry a prominent warning statement about potential laxative effects.
That is fascinating. So when someone confidently says, whey protein hurts my stomach, they might simply be reacting to a heavy dose of xylitol, or perhaps a cheap thickening agent like xanthan gum or carrageenan that the company used to make the shake feel like a thick milkshake, rather than the dairy itself.
That is very often the case. It highlights how incredibly important it is to read the full ingredient list, not just the macro numbers. You want an ingredient list that is as short as possible.
But what if it is not the sweeteners? What if someone buys an unsweetened pure powder with no gums or polyols and it still wrecks their stomach? What if it actually is the dairy?
That is the other major biological possibility, and it requires understanding the difference between an intolerance and an allergy.
Explain the difference.
If someone has lactose intolerance, it means their small intestine does not produce enough of the enzyme called lactase, which is required to break down milk sugar. When they drink a basic whey concentrate, the undigested lactose ferments in the gut, causing significant cramps, gas, and diarrhea.
And the solution for that is the isolate we talked about earlier.
Exactly, because the microfiltration process removes almost all the lactose. Switching to a high-quality whey isolate often solves the digestive problem completely for someone who is merely lactose intolerant.
And what about a true allergy?
A true milk allergy is entirely different. It is an immune system response, not an enzyme deficiency. It means your immune system falsely identifies the actual dairy proteins, the casein or the whey itself, as dangerous invaders.
That sounds much more serious.
It is. It triggers an allergic reaction that can range from hives to anaphylaxis. If a person has a true milk allergy, then whey is completely off the table. Switching to isolate will not save them. They must avoid dairy entirely.
That is a critical distinction. Are there any other physical reactions people should be aware of? I know the skincare community talks a lot about dairy and breakouts.
Skin concerns, specifically acne, are definitely discussed in relation to whey protein. The scientific evidence is not entirely simple or universal, but there are multiple dermatological studies that suggest a strong association between dairy protein intake and acne severity in certain populations.
How does that actually work?
The mechanism is believed to be related to dairy's impact on insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1, which can stimulate the sebaceous glands in the skin to produce more oil.
So it actually changes the oil production in your face.
Potentially, yes, but the response is highly, highly individual. One person might consume 2 scoops of whey daily for a decade and maintain absolutely flawless skin, while another person might notice cystic breakouts immediately upon starting a new tub.
So what is the practical advice there?
The practical approach is boring but highly effective. If a powder makes you feel bad, whether it is disrupting your gut or breaking out your skin, you simply treat it like any other food that disagrees with your biology. You stop forcing it.
That makes perfect sense.
You adjust the dose. You try a highly filtered isolate to see if removing the lactose helps, or you simply choose a different protein source entirely. You do not have to suffer for the sake of a supplement.
I agree completely. And speaking of different sources, if whey is totally off the table for someone because of an allergy or an ethical choice, what are the best alternatives that actually provide a similar biological benefit? Because I know not all plant proteins are created equal.
That is very true. If we zoom out, whey is just one single option in a very massive protein toolbox. If you need a plant-based alternative, soy protein is a phenomenal option.
Why soy?
Soy is one of the few well-known plant sources that naturally contains all the essential amino acids in highly meaningful amounts, making it a complete protein just like whey.
But what if someone wants to avoid soy?
Then you look at plant blends. A single plant source, like pea protein, might be slightly low in a specific amino acid, like methionine. But if a manufacturer blends pea protein with rice protein, the two amino acid profiles complement each other perfectly, resulting in a powder that achieves a complete amino acid profile remarkably similar to whey.
And we should not forget that you can just eat normal food, right?
Absolutely. That is the most grounding perspective of all. Whole food options like eggs, standard dairy foods like Greek yogurt or cottage cheese, lean meat, fish, and lentils are all exceptional, highly bioavailable proteins.
So the powder is totally optional.
You categorically do not need a powder to be healthy, to lose weight, or to build muscle. Powders are just a tool for convenience when eating real food is not possible.
That is such a relieving thing to hear. It brings us right back to the idea that this is just food. But before we wrap up, there is one more uncomfortable reality regarding the supplement industry itself that we have to discuss. The issue of contamination.
Yes, that is an area that requires serious, critical attention, especially for competitive athletes or highly health-conscious consumers. The bodybuilding and sports performance supplement industry has a heavily documented, very dark history of contamination and intentional adulteration.
How does that actually happen? Are these companies just careless?
It is a mix of poor manufacturing standards and intentional deception. In many countries, dietary supplements are regulated entirely differently than standard pharmaceuticals. They do not require strict pre-market approval from regulatory bodies to prove they are safe or effective before they hit the shelves.
So it is kind of the Wild West.
Exactly. Because the supply chains for raw ingredients are global and complex, there have been countless instances of unlisted pharmacologically active substances finding their way into the tubs.
When you say pharmacologically active substances, what exactly are we talking about?
We are talking about trace amounts of anabolic steroids, prohormones, SARMs, which are selective androgen receptor modulators, unlisted high-dose stimulants, and dangerous heavy metals like lead and arsenic.
That is terrifying. How does it get in there?
Sometimes it is cross-contamination because a factory uses the same mixing vats for a pre-workout stimulant and a protein powder. Other times, it is an intentional effort by a shady manufacturer to make their protein powder yield better results by quietly spiking it with banned anabolic agents.
That is deeply concerning. So you could be drinking a shake every morning and consuming something entirely different from what is printed on the label.
Exactly. For a casual, everyday gym goer, the risk might mean occasionally and unknowingly ingesting trace amounts of unlisted caffeine, which might just ruin their sleep.
Still annoying, but not life-threatening.
Right. But for a drug-tested athlete, it is a literal career-ending risk. Anti-doping agencies around the world explicitly warn their athletes that dietary supplements are a major source of positive drug tests. In tested sports, the rule of strict liability applies.
Meaning they're responsible no matter what.
Yes. Saying, "I did not know it was in my protein powder," does absolutely nothing to protect an athlete from a 4-year ban.
So how does an athlete, or even just a cautious consumer who does not want to drink heavy metals, protect themselves from that risk?
This is where third-party testing becomes absolutely vital. You cannot blindly trust the holographic branding or the manufacturer's own promises on their website. You must look for credible, independent, third-party testing certifications printed directly on the tub.
What do those look like? What should people search for?
You are looking for specific, trusted seals of approval, such as Informed Choice, NSF Certified for Sport, or BSCG, which stands for Banned Substances Control Group.
And what do those groups actually do?
These programs are independent laboratories. They audit the manufacturing facilities. They verify that the ingredients listed on the label are actually the only things in the tub. And most importantly, they rigorously screen the product batches against a massive database of banned substances and heavy metal contaminants.
That gives a lot of peace of mind.
It does. It does not mean the product is entirely 100% risk-free, because zero risk does not exist in food manufacturing. But choosing a third-party tested product dramatically significantly reduces the risk of accidental doping or ingesting harmful chemical contaminants.
It shows the company is transparent.
It proves the company is willing to let an outsider verify their claims.
That is a crucial, actionable piece of advice for anyone standing in that supplement aisle trying to make a safe choice. It really shifts the entire conversation. When you break it down like this, the biology, the logistics, the label map, and the safety testing, the mystique entirely vanishes. It is not a magic potion that guarantees a perfect body, and it is not a toxic chemical trying to destroy your health.
Exactly. When you take a step back and strip away the aggressive influencer marketing, the panic over anabolic windows, the complicated carbohydrate superstitions, and the unwarranted fear-mongering about food processing, you are left with a very simple, grounded truth. Whey protein is just food.
It reminds me of keeping a bag of frozen broccoli in your freezer. I mean, no one argues that frozen bagged broccoli is magically nutritionally superior to fresh organic broccoli bought directly from a local farmer's market, but it is reliably, steadily there in your freezer when your life is chaotic, when you haven't had time to go to the grocery store, and when you just desperately need to get some vegetables on your plate before bed. Whey protein serves the exact same function. It is reliably there when your appetite is shot, your training demands are high, or your daily schedule simply does not allow for a home-cooked meal.
That frozen broccoli analogy is the absolute perfect takeaway. It completely normalizes the product and removes the anxiety. We often cause ourselves so much unnecessary compounding stress trying to perfectly optimize every single aspect of our nutrition.
We really do.
We worry about exact ingestion timings down to the minute, we stress over highly complex mathematical formulas for our macronutrients, and we agonize over finding the single perfect supplement tub.
And it is all just a distraction.
When, in reality, the most effective science-backed thing we can do is just treat these products like normal, everyday food. We should listen closely to how our individual digestion responds, read the ingredient labels clearly to know what we are actually buying, ensure it is third-party tested if we have safety concerns, and focus entirely on long-term consistency rather than short-term perfection.
That is the ultimate truth of nutrition. Consistency over decades always beats optimization over days. The best dietary approach is always the one you can sustain without constant stress, without stomach pain, and without feeling like a failure just because you missed some mythical 30-minute window.
Exactly.
You just need to find what works for your specific life, your unique biology, and your specific goals. If you do not need the powder because you love cooking and eating whole foods, then you do not need it. But if you do need it because your life is chaotic and busy, it is a fantastic, boring, utterly reliable tool to have sitting in your kitchen.
I could not have said it better myself.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over. We spend so much time and mental energy obsessing over the precise optimization of things like protein timing, the exact filtration methods of our whey, and hitting mathematical macronutrient targets down to the decimal point. But perhaps this intense obsession with dietary micromanagement isn't really about health at all.
Yeah.
Maybe, in a modern world where so much of our daily lives feels entirely out of our control, our schedules, the economy, the news cycle, reducing our food to a highly controllable mathematical equation of inputs and outputs gives us a comforting illusion of control.
That is a fascinating point.
The risk is that in our pursuit of the perfectly optimized human machine, we might accidentally engineer the actual simple joy of eating right out of our lives. Something to think about the next time you're scooping powder into a shaker. Thanks for listening to TalkKast.